does anyone do a comprehensive analysis as to not just the cost to purchase equipment by defence, but also the whole of life costs, and then on the other side of the ledger, how much that input into the economy drives economic growth?
Yeah. And this is an area of examination where you start to begin to understand the real value that accrues from doing the shipbuilding and submarine building programs in Australia, or those other programs where we can. Because the total cost of ownership through life of platforms that are, can be in service up to 30 or more years is substantially greater than the acquisition costs. As a rough rule of thumb, the acquisition costs, which is what we've touched on so far in the ship and submarine building programs, is about a third of the total cost of ownership, because you have to factor in, and that's not in those acquisition prices or costs, you have to factor in the people costs for crews and training, the upkeep costs of the platforms, the upgrade costs of the platform, the repair and maintenance of the platform, the infrastructure that goes along to make them able to do all of that work in Australia, and the extent to which industry is involved in that is where the payoff begins. If you get the acquisition strategy right, you can get a significant national value payoff in the in-service phase, which can involve, if you've set up by building in Australia the supply chain to not only feed the primes with the major pieces of equipment, but all of the companies in Australia that are feeding into the primes. And then you've got all of those companies resident in Australia that are able to move into the sustainment phase and ensure their business over a long-term sense. All of that money now, or much more of that money, is now being spent in Australia. And that generates an economic outcome, and it generates an industrial outcome if you get the strategy right to start with. And so, I mean, as a for instance of the size of this, at the beginning of the Future Submarine Program, Heather Ridout from when she was chair of the Australian Industry Group, she said the Future Submarine Program will employ about 1,000 Australian companies, and about 90% of those would be small to medium enterprises, by whatever definition existed at that time. And I think they were talking about 20 people or less. So it's a very substantial cross-section of businesses in Australia, all of which are keeping the money that we spend on the biggest cost, the in-service cost, here at home. That's a national benefit, and this is why I talk more about the creation of national value rather than the more traditional value for money proposition. You can look at the acquisition costs and you find it very difficult to make a decent value for money judgment about those acquisitions, no matter what sort of cost benefit analysis you do. It's really important to look at the total cost of ownership, and that's very hard to do, because you can really only do that crystal ball gazing on the basis of the experience that you have with past practice. So what do I mean by that? We understood from our experience with the Oberon class submarines that submarine maintenance cost about this. We didn't expect that it was going to cost a lot more than that, but it did, because Collins is a very different beast from the old Oberons. So you have to be able to sensibly extrapolate the total cost of ownership and do those forecasts and do them as accurately as you can, and that's a very challenging science to be involved with.
So are you game to do a quick cost-benefit analysis of adjusting Australia's defence policy to take into account the risk factors that we've discussed?
Well, I guess I'd put it to you in terms like this, Fiona. We spend a lot of money on defence. We have, in my lifetime associated with defence, expended a huge amount of energy trying to be efficient. I think there is a different calculus that must be taken into account, and it is, are we effective? Because if we're not effective when the crunch comes, this is the greatest inefficiency of all. There is no value nationally from losing. We better make sure we can win.